Okay, thank you everyone for joining the Art of Content Development with Erica Murphy and Shelby Cummings. Just a little bit of rules before we start. We have a Q&A section that's on your right-hand side. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. And if you just want to chat, let us know where you are, where you're from, what you're representing, what's your podcast, then put it in the chat. And I'm Jeannie Dawkins, and I am from the Parenting Cipher podcast. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Take it away, ladies.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Shelby.
And I'm Erica, and we are the hosts of the All Things Melanin podcast. So we are so excited to have each and every one of you joining us today for our session. So thank you. So today we'll be talking about the art of content development. So let's jump right into kind of the table of contents, just what we're going to be covering today. First, we're going to start off with just a general introduction of who Shelby and I are as All Things Melanin, giving you our brand story, letting you know how we actually became a podcast. And then we'll get into talking about what is your brand story. Then we'll talk about creating your podcast structure. We'll give you some tips for creating your outline, how to pivot, and we'll talk about what makes good storytelling. And then we'll talk about how to create engaging content. And so we'll save the last slide for any questions for our Q&A session. So let's jump right into it, Shelby.
Okay, cool. Okay, so before we get started, kind of want to let you all know how All Things Melanin came to be, how we started, our beginnings, and different things like that. So a little bit of background. Me and Erica have been friends for about 6 years. We actually met at work and really just became fast friends, hanging out at work, hanging out outside of work, traveling, living our best lives. So about maybe 2-ish years into our friendship, Erica and I, we went to this women's brunch where it was just really talking about, women empowerment, being successful, all of those great things. Really, really great brunch. So at the end of the brunch, Erica says to me, she was like, "Hey, friend, I think that we are supposed to do something together." She was like, "I don't know what it is, but I just feel like, we're supposed to do something." I said, "Me too, but I don't know what it is." So this is probably around the spring of 2017. Fast forward a couple months, we went to Essence Fest for our annual girls trip. And honestly, we just had an amazing time. And we were so inspired, by all of the just Black excellence, sharing their stories, the panels, the speakers, the events, and different things like that. Erica and I had so many conversations about, potentially one day doing something in media, but none of our backgrounds are in media. And we did not want to go back to school just for that. So after the brunch, in my dramatic fashion, I call Erica up and I say, "Hey, friend, I want to talk to you. I got an idea, but I got to talk to you in person." And she said, "Cool." So we got together a few days after we got back from Essence, and I broached the idea to her. I was like, "Hey, friend, like, let's start a platform that's dedicated to, Black women." We felt like there are a lot of outlets out there for Black women and Black people. However, we didn't really feel like there was anything out there that was specific to us, that was motivating us, that was inspiring us, and that was really encouraging us to live our best lives on our own terms. So we decided that we were going to create that. So one weekend we got together and we really just wrote down every single name and every single idea that we could. And we decided on December 15th, 2017 to launch our lifestyle blog, which is dedicated to motivating women to pursue their passion. And we do this through blogging, vlogs, our Go Getter Spotlight, our YouTube series, and the All Things Melanin podcast. We really have created an online platform that is inclusive and engaging. We are your self-proclaimed hype women who are constantly building a loyal following of women of color who visit our blog for positivity, encouragement, and sisterhood. So we're about a year into the blogging game, and we decided, hey, let's start a podcast. In full transparency, we didn't know anything about podcasts, but we figured it out and we launched the All Things Melanin podcast in the summer of 2018. Our podcast really is centered around really just kind of our lives and navigating our lives and really just being open, honest, transparent, and really vulnerable about where we are. We talk about dating and relationships, the good, the bad, the ugly, what works, what doesn't work, when they tried, when they don't. We talked about the journey to building our brand, the ups and the downs, because we are, genuinely just building from scratch and figuring it out. And, we shared that along our journey as well as building our careers in corporate America. We also have a section of our podcast where we allow people to submit questions to us and we answer them openly and honestly. And then we end out our podcast with faith and a prayer just to kind of round it out. Our podcast, for the most part, is light and cheery and just really, just the day to day of being a millennial Black woman trying to figure it out. So that's kind of our brand story, how we got started, and all of that amazing thing. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so as we've shared with you guys our brand story, before you start to actually create content for your podcast, you want to be sure of or identify what your brand story is. So, in short, a brand story is using a narrative to connect your brand to your audience. So, with a focus on linking what you stand for to the values you share with your audience. So, your narrative is actually created through your brand story. So, in order to create that narrative, you will need to ask yourselves the following very, very important questions that we have listed here. Number one being, who are you as a brand? And what can help you answer that question is, what is your purpose and what is your mission? What are your values? And also, what story do you have to tell? Everyone has a story, right? So, and also, who is your audience? Who are you telling the story to? Who is resonating with your values, your mission, your purpose, your brand? You want to be sure that you identify each of those things so that you understand who you are as a brand. And once you nail down those answers to those questions, you now have your brand story, and that will be the foundation of the content that you create for your podcast. So next slide on creating your podcast structure.
Yeah. So when it comes to creating your podcast structure, obviously different strokes for different folks, but these are a few of the things that we had to consider and navigate through when we were deciding, what do we want our podcast to look like? Like, what do we want it to be made up of? So definitely you have to decide if you want your podcast to be year round or seasonal when you're thinking about your structure. I will say that Erica and I, when we first started out, our podcast was year round. We just really recorded back to back. And we found that did not work for us. We found that kind of burnt us out a little bit. We got like content block and all those different things. I know that some people do that and it works for them, but we found that having a break and making it seasonal worked for us a little bit better. If you do decide to have different seasons, you need to decide within your structure, how many episodes do you want per season? So for us, when we did decide to go seasonal, we decided that about 6 to 8 episodes work for us. Full disclosure, when me and Erica record, we do not record weekly. We batch record. So we will get together about 1 or 2 times out of a month, and we will record 4 episodes at a time, mix those together and schedule them out, just so that, like I said, we don't really get burnt out and, we can focus on creating content in our audience and different things like that. Decide how much time you want to be in between each season if you're going to be seasonal. Definitely you have to take into account, you don't want it to be too little time to where you don't get to rest and re-energize, and kind of get your creative juices flowing. But you don't want it to be too long to where your audience forgets about you and they're yearning for you and different things like that. A suggestion, we found that for us, we take about a month break. That is enough time for us to re-energize, to refresh, to come to the table with fresh ideas, and to get back to our audience. We don't like to stay away too long. We just like them to miss us a little bit. Decide how long each podcast episode will be. So this is going to vary. So for us, our episodes tend to be about 45 minutes to an hour long, but depending on your niche and depending on what you're talking about, is dependent on, how long each episode is going to be. So definitely what we suggest when, you are kind of deciding this is once you start recording and podcasting and different things like that, see about how long, your audience is staying tuned to you and different things like that. Definitely if you have the content and you can hold your audience and you have a lot to say, then, it can be longer. But, if you can get to the point and, do it in a shorter amount of time, definitely do that. You just kind of have to gauge that and see what your audience prefers. And then honestly, just ask people, ask them like, how long did you say intrigued and interested, and adjust as necessary. Decide if you want your podcast to have segments or to focus on one subject. So as you all know, there are so many different podcasts out there, and some podcasts do have certain segments and some podcasts do have one main subject. I honestly really think it just depends on your niche, and I think it depends on your interest and, what your podcast is about. So I would definitely say if you are someone who likes to talk about, different things and you have different interests, I would definitely suggest coming up with different segments within your podcast to kind of break it up a little bit. But however, if you are an industry expert on something and you are extremely passionate about something, I would definitely suggest, just focusing on one main subject. Honestly, there is no right or wrong answer to your podcast structure. It honestly just depends on you, what you need, and what your audience is going to prefer. And then obviously, if you do decide on segments, really, if you do decide to have segments, really just decide what segments you want to make of your podcast, and really just, and when you're deciding that, what are you passionate about? What are you talking about? What do through your segments, like how are you going to be able to give back to your audience and to keep them, intrigued and, sharing your message and sharing your podcast and different things like that. A tip we have for your podcast structure is really just going through and pre-planning your structure. It's really going to make the process to recording more smooth and more easy. And just we found that once we kind of, went through all of these questions and nailed down our podcast, we just really wrote it out, wrote a few key talking points, and that has really allowed us to maximize our time when we are recording and really see what works best for us. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so now that you have created your podcast structure, let's say, whether you decided if you'll have segments or one main subject with the talking points, you want to create your outline. So we recommend that you always include in your content a podcast introduction and an outro on each episode, because your introduction should include obviously your podcast name, the name that you go by, and asking your audience to follow, subscribe, share with a friend, or giving them some sort of call to action within that intro. So a quick tip is that you can pre-record your intro and outro clip if you prefer, so that you'll have that to always just add into your each episode during your editing. So we have included an example of our intro that we want to actually play for you. So Jamie, can you hit the play button? I don't hear anything. I don't think it's playing for us.
Did you hear it?
No, I couldn't hear it. I don't think anyone.
Okay, let's try again. Maybe because I was muted.
Thanks for tuning in to
Okay.
Be sure to subscribe, like this week's episode, and share with a friend. Now let's get into this week's episode. Hi, I'm Shelby.
And I'm Erica.
And welcome to the All Things Melanin podcast, where your certified hype women are getting you through the week.
Be sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an update.
Did you hear it?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now that you have your solid intro and your outro for your outline, the next steps is you want to brainstorm or decide what topics you're passionate about. What do you want to talk about? Then based on how your podcast is structured, you want to decide if you want to break those topics down into segments, as Shelby was saying, and if so, how many. So, for example, Shelby and I, on our podcast, we have 4 to 5 segments per episode. And I say 4 to 5 is because sometimes we incorporate guests. And so that particular segment is called Dreams and Connections. And we don't always have guests on every episode, but when we do, it just kind of creates that consistency for our audience, or creates consistency for your audience when you do have those segments, so they become familiar with how your show is run. So also another quick tip would be to give your segments a catchy title. So this just simply adds originality, it adds personality to your content. And then next, you would want to be sure to create your talking points for your topics or segments. Talking points are super helpful to keep you on track and on your subject or conversation. I know that Shelby and I, when we get to talking, just because we are friends in real life, we'll start talking about one subject, and then it's like, girl, did you? And it's like, whoa, that's a whole nother subject for a whole nother podcast, which is fine. But having those talking points is really helpful as you're recording to go back to that. So obviously, as you are storytelling, it's easy to veer off into another story or another topic, but those talking points, having those within your outline that you're creating, it helps you guide to just navigate back to that content or conversation. So next slide on how to pivot.
Yeah. So, a lot of times when once you've created your podcast and different things like that, obviously it's going to be on a certain subject, on a certain niche, and be about, certain things and different things like that. For instance, like I said, Erica and I podcast is really based on the millennial woman, as we are dating, as we're getting relationships and trying to settle down, as we are trying to build a brand, and as we're kind of on this faith walk and different things like that. However, there are going to be times where, on your podcast journey, that different things are going to occur, and different things like that. So an example of that is this. So Erica and I's podcast is really, really light. It's really, really fun. We giggle, we laugh, we drink our wine, we have a good old time. But as you know, 2020 has just been, really difficult with so much going on, with the election, with the passing of George Floyd, with the passing of Breonna Taylor, and so many other Black people. It was just a lot. So we actually took a really, really small hiatus when this was occurring. And when we decided to start recording again and different things like that, we were like, we're going to have to speak on this in our own way, like as Black women living in a Black world with, Black partners and family members and dads and all these different things. Like, it would just be so off brand for us, especially since we talk about empowering Black women and Black people, to not say anything. So we really had to adjust our content based on current events. So we had a particular episode called The B is for Black. No, it was called The B is for Black. And this is a cookout where we shifted our content a little bit. So for instance, on our dating and relationship segment, we pivoted during that time, and we really just focused on how we were feeling, our emotions, what we were doing, what other people could do, how to be an ally, because we just felt like we needed to use our platform to speak up about what was going on versus, dating relationships, that particular episode. We also pivoted during that episode, and on our journey where we usually talk about, building our brand and the ins and outs, we really pivoted to show how brands are responding around that time, and still today. But that's kind of when the conversation started about, how diverse is your company? What type of policies do you have to support your Black employees? What are you doing? Are you empowering Black employees? Just that different conversation that we were having, and forcing people to, be held accountable. We really kind of pivoted and shifted our content based on current events because it made sense for us and it was true to our brand. So if something is occurring, in your industry and it's trending and it makes sense, never be afraid to pivot and talk about that on your podcast. That's another way to intrigue people. That's another way to let people know that you are flexible and adaptable to your topics, but that you also know how to read the room and you know how to read your audience. Like if you know that your audience, like we know that our audience, a lot of our audience are Black women and some Black men and just women in color in general. So it would have really been tone deaf of us not to speak up and say anything. So in that instance, that was a really good example of us pivoting, reading the room, and really paying attention to current events, what's happening in our industry, what's trending, and we really use it just to, share our experiences, to storytell, and to connect with our audience so that they knew that they weren't alone and that they could relate. And when we did that, we really didn't know if our audience was going to be receptive to that. But for us, it was just really more important to be our authentic selves and speak on it because that's what we felt. And it ended up being one of our most popular episodes that we have to date. Next slide, please.
So let's say now you know your brand story, you've decided on your podcast structure, you've created your outline with your talking points or your segments. Now it's time to focus on creating good storytelling. So what actually makes good storytelling? Think about your narrative. Remember, your narrative is created through your brand story. So within your storytelling outline, you should always obviously introduce the story and then having those talking points. So some quick tips for that would be good storytelling resonates with your audience best when you are real and you share your real life experiences, when you're vulnerable, when you're authentic, and when you're relatable. Like Shelby was just saying, when we had to pivot into talking about some heavier topics from what we normally do, we were very vulnerable. We were very raw, and it ended up being one of our most rawest episodes to date. So when you share your vulnerability, you are connecting emotionally with your audience. So also, when you share your story, you want to think about the following points that we have listed here. So when you share, how can that actually improve or help your audience in some way? So basically, when you're sharing this story, what's in it for your audience? Why are you telling this story? What can they take away from what you're telling them or what you're sharing with them? So for example, within our podcast, we have a segment called Mentor Moment. So this segment is when a listener submits a question to us through email or DM, and we just give our take on it, each of our opinions. So our responses to those makes really, really good storytelling because we usually can relate to the experience that's at hand for that scenario, and we just give our honest truth about it. So with that being said, that's how you connect emotionally with your audience, as I mentioned before. So a major key that you always want to remember with storytelling is that people will buy into people first. So just make sure you're your authentic self. I can't stress that enough. That is a sure way that you can connect with the people that are listening to your podcast. So think about what tips or what stories you can share to connect, to relate to your audience more. One thing that Shelby and I, one thing our goal was is to just go deeper with our storytelling. We said we needed to be a little bit more open because naturally we're not. So with our podcast, it's like if we're going to talk about some real subjects that every Black woman can relate to, we have to put ourselves out there. We have to just take it there a little bit deeper. So that's how we're able to relate to our audience more. And so with each of these points, at the end of the day, just be honest. Be who you are. Your narrative is your narrative. Somebody gonna feel it. So somebody will resonate with the story that you tell. So let's move on to the next slide on how to create engaging content.
Okay, so last but not least, so basically how to create engaging content, how to come up with ideas and different things like that. So here are some tips and tricks that have just really, really worked for us when we're coming up with content, ideas, topics, and different things like that. Leverage your social media. So whatever social media platforms you have, whether that's Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, your family, the group chat, whatever. Don't be afraid to ask them, What type of content do you want to hear from us? What did you like? What don't you like? So maybe, making posts on your social media, to asking your family members, creating polls, like on your IG stories or on Twitter and different things like that. Getting feedback from people so that you're making sure that you're creating content that your audience wants to, hear. And a lot of times we found that people love to voice their opinion. People love to have a say in something. So if you ask them, they're definitely going to tell you. So that's a great way to come up with content. Also, what's trending? Like, always be aware of, what's trending. Like, go and see what people are talking about on Twitter, or see what's trending in your industry. Always be aware, and follow public mediums and different things like that that are relevant to you, so that you know what people are talking about. And if it's relevant to you, you can definitely take that as a topic to utilize for your podcast. Also, research. Don't be afraid to listen to podcasts that are outside of your niche or what you're talking about. A lot of times I'll listen to podcasts that are totally different than from what maybe Erica and I record and talk about, but then in the middle of it, I'll randomly get a topic or idea, and I'll write it down. Watch different, talk shows that are on TV, and really, really just be open to different things, such as, maybe reading articles, seeing what's on LinkedIn, seeing what's on Twitter, reading books. You never know what you're going to be inspired by. So never be afraid to go out and listen and consume different types of media that are very different than, what you consume and different things like that. Some other tips are just kind of what we've reiterated. Make sure that you're staying true to yourself, and that you're being very authentic. Me and Erica keep it very, very conversational. We really just try to speak in a way that if you came up to us on the street, or you were having a glass of wine with us, that's literally how we try to keep it light and conversational. Encourage your audience by encouraging them to leave you a comment, sliding your DMs with a question or a thought on a topic. A lot of times, when you're engaging with your audience on social media, maybe they will leave you a comment, and maybe you will, go back and forth and, have a conversation with them in the DMs. Erica and I have found that a lot of times when we create content, and maybe we'll post a clip of it on social media, like sometimes people will, talk to us in our DMs. Like, we encourage you, definitely, if it makes sense and, it's not rude, to talk back to them, because a lot of time they will give you insight. A lot of time they will give you their opinions, and sometimes they'll even give you suggestions. Like, don't sleep on your audience sliding in your DMs, because a lot of time we forget that word of mouth is, just as popular as, promoting on social media, advertising, and different things like that. And if they leave a comment, reply with a very thoughtful comment back, because we found sometimes, people will actually comment, how we've had whole conversations on our posts before where people may have had a different point of view from what we said, and they commented and they let us know, and it really created a dialogue and a conversation, and it even created other ideas, for other topics, whether we talked about it or we brought somebody in that was a more of an expert on it. So don't sleep on having conversations with your audience on social media. That can be another way where you can come up with content ideas and topic ideas. Also, brainstorm. Me and Erica are big proponents of, when we're trying to brainstorm and we're coming up with ideas, when we first start out, no idea is a stupid idea. So we really encourage you to write down every single thing that you can think of and that you can brainstorm on a topic. And then, once you have all of your ideas down, definitely go back and, niche down and see what works for you and what's going to work best. Just kind of reiterating it again, definitely be open to consuming different types of media. That's another way to get out of a brain fog. And really just kind of open your mind up to think, and not necessarily be so specific on what you're talking about at first. Draw on personal experiences. A huge majority of our podcast are things that we are going through, or have dealt with, or are trying to figure out. And a lot of times, when we're going through different things, for instance, Erica and I, we are millennials, and we are in the dating phase, and it is very interesting. So a lot of the questions and the topics that we have on our dating segment are things that we're going through, things that our friends are going through, things that we see other women talking about on Twitter, and we're like, girl, that is so real. So we will take it into a sit and use it for ourselves. So if it makes sense, don't be afraid to draw on your personal experiences. Like, nobody even has to know. It's your personal experience if you don't want them to. But that's also a good way to, see what your friends and your family and your coworkers are talking about, and just kind of jot that down. See what your competitors are doing. If you are, for instance, let's say you have a podcast about, leaving movie reviews, go listen to other podcasts that have movie reviews. And we're not saying copy them, but we're saying see what they're doing, see what's working with them. Go on their social media, see what they're talking about, seeing what they're sharing, seeing how they're utilizing their audience, and, take ideas. And adjust it to work for you. Like, sometimes it's a really good way to get inspired and, maybe to get out of a brain fog if, you're not coming up with content. See what your audience is naturally engaging with in different things like that. See what they're talking about. See who they're following. Don't be afraid to, go through some of your followers and, see what they're commenting on or what type of pages they follow, and, going through and looking at that as well. It's a good way to research. It's a good way to find out, who they are and different things like that. Don't be afraid to try different types of content. Once you create your content and different things like that, you're definitely going to have to promote it. So when you're creating content and different things like that, don't be afraid to try different types, such as, maybe taking a quote from your podcast and posting that on your social media, maybe creating like a graphic from headliner with like just a little snippet to kind of entice them and different things like that. A lot of times, one thing that me and Erica do once our podcast drops on Thursdays. So every Thursday we create a snippet from headliner, and it gives like a little piece of what we're talking about, and we direct them to, if it's on Instagram, to go to the link and click on it. Twitter, you can, just click directly on it. It gives them a little bit of insight. It riles them up a little bit, and it really entices them to go and different things like that. So we have like a little example of a snippet that we have. Jeannie, can you play that, please?
When like real life stuff happens and your back up against the wall, you feel like crying, or you're down, or you don't know what to do, or you're not at your best. Like the people that showed up for me in that season, those are people that I'm glad to call friends. Those are people that I'm gonna go to war for. Those are people that I will pull up at 3 a.m. for. Those are my people. And I think that we have to get very clear of what we think a friend is and make sure that those people are aligning and reciprocating that into our life. What do you think, friend?
Yeah, and I think that the sad part about that is you won't know which category to put your friends in: best friend, good friend, acquaintance, right, until you actually do experience something where you need a best friend. Right. And so it can be disappointing when you thought, people in your circle really ain't in your corner.
Yeah, so that's kind of like a snippet that we use to, promote on social media and different things like that. And then a lot of times, once we, produce the snippet and we put it on social media, it really creates a buzz. It really creates conversation. People start talking under the comments or, in our DMs, and it allows us to, get feedback on how we're doing, get feedback on the type of content that we're creating, and even get, new ideas just from what people are saying and different things like that. Just overall, when it comes to creating content, definitely do what's best for you. Do what going to allow you to stay true to yourself and to be authentic, but don't be afraid to ask people, what they think, or for ideas, or for feedback, and don't be afraid to pivot and try new things. Next slide, please.
So now we'll just open up the floor for any questions. If any of you have questions, just drop it in the chat and we'll go ahead and answer.
Can I ask a question on the microphone?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right,
Yeah.
because it was getting too long to type. So,
That's fine.
I've had a podcast. We just finished up our 3rd season. We're very niche. I appreciated that you ladies said that, you know, you're young Black millennial women. My podcast is geared towards Gen X, specifically because I don't think there's anything out there for Black Gen X women, specifically Black single Gen X women. Going even further, specifically Black Gen X women with no kids. So we have a wide-ranging audience, but we really are trying to figure out the best way to connect and find more of our people, if you will, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to figure out if it's Facebook, if it's more Instagram. What are some of your ideas, and especially when you don't really have an analogous competition out there, because so much stuff is really geared towards millennials and there's not a lot of stuff geared towards Gen Xers. So how would you describe going around trying to figure out like where is our audience and how best to reach them?
So what I would suggest is definitely, so the first thing I would suggest is looking at your podcast analytics. So you definitely just told us your niche and different things like that. And I'm not sure which hosting platform you're using, but usually whatever hosting platform you're using, it will definitely tell you, what they're utilizing to listen to your podcast, where they're located, where they're listening for, and different things like that. So I think once you have, your analytics and then all the information that you just shared with us, what I would suggest is creating kind of like in advertising, we call it a buyer persona. So really just making up trying to find the right word, I can't think now, but really just making up a prototype or a person that represents your audience. And you can create one of those, two of those, three of those, however many that you want to create. And when you create this buyer persona, all of those things that you just shared with us, include that in your buyer persona, but also include like, what does this person look like? What does this person like to do? Where would this person more than likely, do on, a daily basis? Like you said, this person, you share with us, this person, doesn't have kids. This person is single. This person is basically, living their best life. So once you kind of create that buyer persona, I would also just continue to do more research to see where these people prefer to consume media. So doing research to see, okay, is this group of people more so on Facebook? Research to see if this person more so on Instagram or Twitter or whatever that may be. I think that's a really good place to start. And then once you kind of come up with your buyer persona and different things like that, I will also see like what other types of things does this person like to do, or what other places, does this person like to go, and different things like that, because it may be a situation where, if, the people that are listening to your podcast, let's just say the first thing that's coming to my mind, maybe they really, really like to listen to the news. So maybe it's, cross collaborating with another podcast or another social media influencer to get in front of their audience, if their audience is very similar to yours. So that's what I would suggest.
Thanks very much. Very helpful.
One thing I would add to that too is what was helpful for Shelby and I in the beginning is we created essentially a survey. I think we used the resource Survey Monkey. If you want to look into that, where we actually asked a handful of questions and sent them to our current audience to kind of gauge like how we're resonating with them and like what they're so for an example, if you're not sure where your audience is on as far as on social media, you can literally create your own question and say, which of these social media outlets do you prefer using? And then that way, when you get all of your feedback, you can see, okay, the majority of our audience is using Facebook. So you always can, promote your podcast episode or push out more using Facebook. So That's always really helpful just to kind of gauge and get feedback on your current audience, and then that'll give you some insight on how to pivot or which direction to go from there. So that's just a tidbit for you as well.
Thanks again. Appreciate it. Good advice. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Hi, Shelby and Erica.
Hey.
I have a
Hi.
question about developing like an engaging podcast voice. Like when you're doing content that is listening only, you want to kind of capture your audience's attention. But how do you practice on getting that podcast voice and making sure that you're communicating your content in an engaging way?
I would say, go ahead, friend.
No, you got it. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so when we first started out, I would definitely say that this is something personally that I struggled with because I just really didn't know how to go about it. But one thing I found that really, really worked for me is I just made sure that I was the most comfortable and relaxed that I could be. I think when you're trying to develop your podcast voice and, make sure that it's engaging and different things like that, make sure that whenever you're recording, make sure that you're relaxed, make sure that you're comfortable, make sure like if you have like a lot of different things on your mind, make sure that you've gone to a place in your day where you have just kind of let that all go so you can focus. And then not sure if we're supposed to say this, but it works for me. I always have a glass of wine when I'm recording, and I really just try to focus on, just being my most authentic self. What works, I'm not sure if you have a co-host or not, but what works for me and Erica is, since we're friends, we just kind of really, feed off of each other's energy. And we really just kind of hold each other accountable, for just being authentic and being ourselves. Because we found that when we try to maybe not be as vulnerable or not be as open, like that did translate into it. But when we, we're just ourselves, like we were just talking on the street or at brunch, it was better for us. You have anything to add to that, friend?
Yeah, I would just say to make sure that it's an engaging conversation or content, is just keep it conversational, like Shelby mentioned earlier. That's really, really important. And even if you decided to, like, before you created the outline for that particular episode or that for those seasons, maybe you just utilize your social media and put a question out there or a poll out there, and just have people's opinions about whatever question or whatever topic that you plan on talking about, and then let your audience know that you're going to address that in the next episode. People love to feel included. People feel like, oh, okay, she really understands and wants to, get my opinion on this. People love that. So I think that would be a good thing to try too. If you find that what you're doing now, you feel like it's not as engaging, you can always just use your social media, use those platforms to bring in your audience and make them feel like they're inclusive. So that would be my little tip on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Come on, give us one more.
Hello, I have one. So
Hi.
you talked about breaking your episodes up into season and making sure that you have a good time between letting your audience be able to miss you. For the social media side of that, what would you suggest on engaging your audience? Do you think it's too too often to post, or like how do you kind of separate when you post and engage your audience through social media?
Yeah, so for us, even when we do go on break from recording and different things like that, we still choose to post to social media, just past episodes so that people, can make sure that they're caught up, or, we will post like a snippet to our social media um, at least once a week. But even when we are on our quote off season, we'll still post to our social media about our podcast, about catching up and different things like that, at least once or twice a week. That includes like posting past snippets, but also, trying to engage and ask our audience, okay, like, is there anything in particular that, you want us to talk about on our different segments, whether that's dating and relationships, or the journey, or submitting a question for our mentor moment. We, even when we're off duty for our podcast, we still do engage on social media, and we do that about once or twice a week, just so that they don't essentially so they don't forget about us and different things like that.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. So we also do.
Oh.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, friend.
No, go ahead. I think we were going to say the same thing, but you got it. Go ahead.
I was going to say thank you all for joining our session. We really hope that you got something out of it and different things like that. We did create a handout that I think Jeannie may have put in the chat. That's really just kind of a summary of everything that we talked about, so that you can have for your personal notes when creating content for your podcast. And if you have any questions or anything like that, you can always reach out to us on our website, through our email, on social media, and we will be happy to answer any questions that you have.
I'm sorry, you said that the
Thanks
hand
for joining us.
Chat.
Yes, is it in the chat,
Yeah.
Jeannie? Sorry, I think it's the first one, maybe.
Yes, so it's in the chat, and I believe Talib also dropped them in the Q&A.
Okay. But if for some reason it's not there, you don't get it, you can email us at allthingsmelantv@gmail.com, and we'll send it to you too.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope that everyone attends the lunch and learn today.
Yes. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Jeannie.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day, everybody.
Bye, y'all.